Hey, we're live. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Knapsack AMA. I'm Chris, the CEO, co-founder of Knapsack, here with Evan, my other co-founder, head of product and engineering.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day.
So please, the intention of an AMA is usually to answer questions from the audience. So if there's anybody out there that is interested in learning more about design systems, Knapsack, etc., we spend lots of time talking to lots of different companies about design systems, and so we're fairly steeped in this world. With that, kicking up a couple of questions of my own. I had a really fascinating conversation last week about the idea of component SDKs. Um, and so there was an organization that I was chatting with that talked about how their focus on a design system has been about how they actually create an API for each component and use that as an SDK for delivery of their applications. I was I hadn't heard about this concept much. I kind of looked into it a little bit more, and it seems kind of interesting. So I'm curious what you think about this, Evan.
Well, okay. First, okay. You say like there's an API for your component. I mean, isn't that just like the props and spec of a
Right.
component anyway? Or how is
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
different? Like,
No, it's that, but then they have it built into some like packaged SDK that is then ultimately like just in time delivery of those components into interfaces.
okay. Um, yeah, I'm curious how this gets like used. I mean, is it basically like a CMS that exposes all of those props and things like that?
Yes,
And
that
so
seemed to be what it was all about.
okay. Yeah. I could see something where basically, your button can be small, medium, large, and it's in a CMS, and you can use it for basically like, hey, um, adding like a hero to the home page. What size do you want the button? And then one day the design system puts out extra large button, and then just by updating the design system, the CMS now has got four size options instead of three. Is that kind of the what they're using it for, or what would be
Yeah, that
possible?
that seemed to be it, right? Like, it was about composition and assembly, and I think that, like, they had their own kind of homegrown CMS capability here, where it was like, "Hey, we have this component assembly experience, composition experience, what have you, that was really focused on, like, how do I deliver this experience into an app?" And that felt like a CMS. But anyway, I mean, like, I guess the idea that I was trying to go with here was, like, when we think about consumption of components, broadly speaking, what do you see as like the new innovative stuff happening in terms of like actually getting the components we build into the products that users use?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a trend towards the composition and basically like, okay, instead of basically like making, um, you know, I don't know, instead of basically making, like a blog post teaser, like they send out like a box and an image and a car and a button, like so being able to kind of do that piece right there. And I think that because some people might want um, the order of the things inside the card different. And so it's easier to just be like, hey, here's all the pieces. And then of course there's, the challenge with that is basically it's like, you know, how do you put the things together, which is like then leading into like why you want to do recipes of like, hey, here is how to put the stuff together.
Yeah, so this is fascinating because the composition side of things, like, what drives all this, right? And also, what's the difference between a recipe and a component? I think that maybe let's start there. What's the difference between a recipe and a component?
A recipe is something that uses components and to get started you copy it and then paste it into your app, and then you can freely edit all of the pieces there. Components, you pass in like props and the inside, and then basically it like renders. And so and the thing is that like the design system team can update the components where they can't update the recipes. I mean, they can update the recipes, but once you've copied it and pasted it, you grab that recipe for how it was that day. And so, you if for example, like a button had like an icon, you're not able to go into the component and move the icon from the right side of the text to the left side of the text because it's inside the component, right? And so you'd have to basically request that they put like a new prop for icon position or something like that. um, and so, but with like, if you think about it, if someone were to have like a card recipe, and it basically, you select it and it's like, okay, it's got a box which does like the outline and the shadow, and then like image, and then text body, and then button. You copy and you paste it in, and you want the button to be above the body. Easy peasy, you just go there and then move it. um, so yeah, I think that recipes should use the components always, though.
Yeah, I think that gets to sort of the fundamental constructive nature of a design system. When you think about the baseline structure being like, okay, I have a bunch of very small building blocks, and those very small building blocks, that's where that really highly modular, really highly reusable stuff comes into play. And then that next level of complexity where you want a lot of variation implementation, I guess it's a continuum of how opinionated things are.
Yeah, if
Where
you have a lot of composable pieces and recipes, you're very unopinionated, right? But you're very flexible because of that.
so the idea is instead of having a card component, a card would be like a wrapper, and then you would assemble or compose that experience out of other components, like a text component, a body component, image component, a button component, maybe a grid component, something like that. They would all
Hmm.
layer in this composable way to ultimately create the recipe for the card you were trying to construct.
Yep, yep. And I mean, you run into the challenge, like the basically maybe somebody, um, so say the the image component had like a little prop that basically made it like fill the card or something like that. Basically the image would go right up against the border of the card. And say some people forgot that, and then so the image was inset like a little bit, it had a little padding, and so across the experience people would see cards where the image was flush and the image was inset. And so like, you right, that might not fly with some people. They're like, whoa, we need some of that consistency there. And so, that's what you would lose with basically some of the composable, going more composable and flexible, is like, you'd lose that control and that consistency of basically like, hey, this is really kind of like the, not so much like the brand guidelines, but you're getting towards that. I don't know, brand guidelines are always like, hey, our images are always flush in the card, but still nonetheless, like, you know. So I
But
think that, like, go ahead.
doesn't that open like an interesting idea about how do you programmatically limit the things that you can compose together? Like, I think that you always use the example like, you want a grid of buttons, but not a grid of heroes.
Yeah.
And so like the ability to say a grid of buttons is fine, a grid of heroes is not. Isn't that just something that should be a configurable way of limiting the scope or creating constraints for that composition?
Yeah, I think that it could be done there where you're like, I've got these slots and only these types of components can go in there. It's a bit tricky on like the technical side. I think it is possible there, but it still is like a little tricky. I think that that's where basically you get into like the classic like do's and don'ts, right?
Mhm.
Of just like, hey, like don't do this. Like, yes, you can, if you have multiple buttons, make one of them the primary. Don't make them all primary, right? It's because like it's tough to, it's technically tough to constrain it, though possible. And usually your team has better things to do, right?
Right.
um
I mean, writing rules engines is like not. not fun or necessarily like super productive, right? And
Yeah.
so I guess like how then do we think about testing our compositions, right? Because we can test components and we can test the ever living heck out of them across accessibility, across performance, across all these different dimensions. But then when it comes to testing that composition or that recipe, like, do we introduce like some sort of like linter like functionality into the recipes that we create? What is the thing that we do to make sure that that recipe still follows all the rules?
Yeah, I mean that is interesting. Is that the design system team could put out tools where you would run that tool, in your app, like a linter that basically could be like, hey, um, you've put three primary buttons in a row. Users are confused by this. I think that's possible. Um, I think that's also technically kind of tricky too, And so I think that like it's there's the age old like slider, right? Of basically like, do you like, what's your design system? Is it like flexible and unopinionated, or opinionated and like, I don't want to say consistent, but yeah, like I think that you just need to pick which end of the spectrum you're on, right? And then basically and try to avoid that middle area, because either give people like a box component, let them build their card, or make a card component and be like, yeah, it's you basically have got this input for your content, but you don't get to kind of like fuss around with it, because that's how you're going to basically get that consistency, right? Like if you're going to do you know, there's going to be like the grid of cards component or whatever that won't let you, like, it will only let you basically take that stuff. And so I think yeah. So I think that that's, if you're worried about that, then and you want to basically put like rigid enforceable rules, then just that's how you make your components. But I think that if you're going to go composable, and you show recipes of how to do it right, and you have docs of what not to do, um, then that's what you're just going to have to be able to kind of do. And again, it is possible to basically put out like something that would throw an error, or somebody did bad UX, although technically functional, like the three primary buttons. But I think that's technically hard, and the teams have got better stuff to do there. So at some point, you just have to trust your users a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, right? I think I'm just trying to understand the trade-offs, right? Because it sounds like the trend in industry is to move towards more composability
Mhm.
because those middleweight complexity things often aren't as modular and reusable as we think. And it makes more sense to construct them out of more modular, more reusable bits than it is to try to make them components in and of themselves. And your organization figuring out where that line is for you, because there's something in between like a multi-step workflow with complicated form logic and a checkout process on the very very complex side of things that like that probably shouldn't be a component, um
Yeah.
down to the like the button, right? And where you pick your line in the sand of everything more complex than here is composed and anything less complex than here is a component. um that's a continuum that I think is interesting. And obviously, like that line is a little bit fuzzy and a little bit soft, but uh, for an for an industry that's often thought about components as the answer, you get lots of design systems that have hundreds of components in them. And oftentimes those components are used sparingly. And the only reason why they're components at all is because it handles some complex or edge use case for something that, yes, is used more than once. And we used to talk about this as like the threshold for when you include something in a design system. Like, you remember the old adage, like, hey, if you use this more than 3 times, it should probably be a component.
Yeah.
Um, I think that the answer to that is changing. And the reason why the answer to that is changing is because of composability.
Yeah. And I think that, well, and also like I think it's kind of interesting there is that like there's also like different levels of like a component. So like um, you could basically say like, hey, I've got this. um, menu that lets you like add an item or add a to a group or something like that. And so and then you're like, okay, it's used in a couple spots in this admin area, so it's a component in like the admin area, and then it basically goes, okay, well maybe this could get used in other spots in that app, and then it just goes to like the app's like components, and then you kind of start, I feel like the components that are specific to an app, there's really like kind of two kinds. There's one that's like, if it's tied to like the data, like if it knows where to get its data from, then it can never go into the design system, right? Um, but then the other components that are basically like they just get passed their data, that and they're in the app. I think those are like design system candidates, basically. Like that's where you would send your component for grooming on basically like, hey, this is, if we just copy pasted this code over into the design system, published it, and then pulled it in from there, it could be, good to go. And so like I think that's a nice kind of staging area for like candidates, right? So like, and how you'd get something kind of ready for it as well. So I think that would be like, it can be a component, but not in the design system, right? And then can kind of prove its need, Um,
Yeah, this is a lot that you brought up there that's also about the context, right? So the context of a component being, is this an admin component? Is this something that's in the core app? And this is where a lot of that systems of system stuff comes into play with the idea of, I have some sort of core system and then I have expressions of that core system that can then be extended or overridden in a system that is like closer to the product that I'm building. And by closer to it, I mean, like, you're actually designing the specific interfaces for that brand or for that product. And I think that it's usually the 2 things that they line up on. There's probably more. There's probably one that's like geography or something like that because of localization. But the ones that I think that I see most commonly are like, I need to take a core brand and then I need to build a separate expression for it, either for this particular brand or for this particular product. And when you look at that, and then you look at like layering composability on top of that, what you're basically looking at is like, I've created a system of inheritance that ultimately has composable elements that exist within a context. And so one of those contexts might be admin. Another of those contexts might be uh uh like logged in experience or dynamic experience. Um so I guess my question is like, how do you keep track of all this stuff? Like, is there a way that you can think of that is able to perceive that context and that level of system that you're at?
yeah, it's interesting. Like, well, we were talking there. I was like, oh boy, like I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who, when they're using like a component, they're like, boy, I wish I could see its like big old lineage tree. Let me know like where I'm at. Like how did this come to be, and where is this thing used, right? Um, that definitely would be quite beneficial. Yeah, it's tough there. I mean, like especially when you get into like systems of systems and like you know brands that inherit like core design system that are used in lots of places. Throw in like a like locale specific on top of it, and like boy, that's like a head spinner right there. Um,
Yeah,
and
it's getting
so
to a level of complexity where you have to be the one that created it to be able to understand it.
yeah, that's tough there. Um, and so it's I think that I don't have the answer, but I have another question, which is like, how do you basically make the hard thing easy? And what I mean by that, actually, let me rephrase that. It's like, how do you make the right decision like easy, right? Isn't that like the kind of thing with design systems is like make it easy to be on brand, right? Like your own components are like easier than going out and finding like a third party library and customizing it to your needs, right? And so it's like make it so when people are trying to get work done quickly and they take the path of least resistance, they're taking the right path.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that there's so much of that that is about, creating that same set of defaults. You said leaning into your experience of your users a little bit. Um, Kind of taking things in a different direction for a second. I'm also curious about this idea that has been really common in conversation for me lately about how the decoupling of visual design from interfaces. And it harkens back to the idea of like, when you and I both were working a lot with content management systems, the decoupling of front end from content. Um, so, you should have like you shouldn't do your rendering in your CMS. You should use your CMS as a service to deliver content into whatever front end you construct yourself in a JavaScript framework, usually. Um, and so there's now this idea about like how do we decouple visual design from interfaces that is been a hot topic recently. And what most people are saying is like we should be thinking about the components that we build as one pixel wide black lines on a white background, and then
Mhm.
they should be void of visual design entirely, and then we should apply that visual design to them in a context, and that visual design application should be able to be expressed very, very differently across exactly the same components.
Yeah, like so is it kind of just getting back to like low fidelity wireframing?
Yeah, but I mean, like, have your components be designed with that in mind. Like, have your baseline system be lo-fi, and then stick the visual design on top of it as like something that can be highly varied.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Right, basically like the visual adornment, right? Isn't that like you know in theory you should be able to have like a pretty like a grayscale design system, if you will, and then it gets used, and then it's just a bunch of design token selections. Um, yep, basically brand agnostic uh, LinkedIn user. Um,
Yeah, the
and
the idea being like, okay, so I can apply animation here just as easily as I can apply shadows, just as easily as I could apply different spacing.
mhm.
Um, and as that representation as tokens, thinking about it as theming or as the application of any visual design that is agnostic from the interface itself.
Yeah, it's funny. A little while ago, Brad Frost put out a blog post about the global design system, um, and I think that if you were at an organization that had, you know, uh, like a core design system and then brand specific design systems, so two layers of design systems, basically, I bet you that core design system would look very similar to what Brad talked about in his global design system, which is quite similar to what we're chatting about here. All like very grayscale, takes care of basically like function and like accessibility, and you know, highly configured through like design tokens. Although probably not all. I mean, you could easily have like some config for the whole thing as well. That might be more than just design tokens, but nonetheless, like I think that's a great spot to be able to start too, because maybe you're not in a situation where you have like a brand design system that inherits from a core design system. Maybe you just have one design system and you want it to be able to withstand like the redesign that happens every couple of years.
Right. Or ideally like a more incremental design that is constantly evolving. I think that there's so many parallels between this and some of the things that like we fought with in the CMS world, right? I mean, you remember all the old like stripped down WordPress and Drupal themes that were like all about just, hey, let's set up some nice regions and let's not put any visual treatment into this at all. It's just like regions on a page. And then that way it was a playground for you to build whatever you wanted on top of that theme. There's a lot of like parallels with that in design system content where it's like, yeah, you can take material, or yeah, you can take Ant, or you can take any number of other design system content that is out there and put it into your system. But then there's either the problem of having to build up from something that's very minimalist or tear down something that's already built for an organization that isn't yours. Um,
Yeah, and those two, when faced with that choice, like I almost always go for build up.
right.
Yep, because it's easier to like be able to like build up than it is to like tear down. Um, well, maybe easier is not the word, but more sustainable. I feel like, uh, yeah, definitely like the full featured things tend to kind of get in your way eventually.
Well, yeah, and upstream problems, and then you end up, fighting the framework of the content as much as you are actually creating with it. And I think that there's some sort of line there, like the question of like how close to material are you, starts to come into play at some point.
Hmm.
But I do think that there is this interesting opportunity for a pioneering idea inside of a big enterprise to say, let's create something that is really intentionally ugly. And that really intentionally ugly thing then just inherits whatever visual design you want at some endpoint. And that feels like a really interesting implementation of a design system where you have a bunch of automation that is built into the visual expression,
Hmm.
and the rest of the focus is on like how do you design really robust interfaces that can accept whatever visual expression gets thrown at it. We should do
Yep.
that. That'd be
How
fun.
do you do that?
Right. How do you do that? Uh,
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a way, like with theming and inheritance and knapsack, that you could build a system like that. And I think that'd be a really interesting like use case at scale to say we have a bunch of really, really amazing bulletproof componentry that accepts pretty much any brand input that you could throw at it via design tokens.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's totally possible for sure. That's a lot of design tokens, but
Yeah, I mean,
totally could be done.
think about the application at like white labeling too. So if you actually wanted to have like a white label design system platform where you're supporting n number of customers with your design system and you don't have any in knowable limitation to that number of customers and what that customer's brand expression is going to look like, that's where you would really want those like super robust interfaces.
Yeah, problems like all things. These problems get really interesting at scale, right? And it's like okay, it's it's enticing how powerful it can be. Like be able to solve a lot of problems in a lot of places, but then there's always like like the ramifications and of course the um, different opinions of from people. So
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for jamming, Evan. This has been fun.
anytime.
We're gonna keep doing these. We'll flash up like when the next one's gonna be here in a second. But you can always go to knapsack.cloud and check out our events. That'll take you to this among many other things. Touch points with our community in some local event meetups that we're planning. Um, of course, our design leadership summits, the design system field guide, and the podcast. So find content from us everywhere. Awesome. Well, hey, good hanging, Evan. Thanks a bunch. Chat with you all later.
Thank y'all. Bye.